Welcome to TSAT. Today I am going to introduce you about disaster management. So, in this context, in the case of disaster management, why this disaster management is being introduced into your syllabus? The reason behind it is, you being an executive, you have to face many number of disasters, and you must be able to show different kinds of solutions to different variant types of disasters. So, that is the reason why this has been introduced into your syllabus. So, in this context, in the case of disaster management, we need to understand what is meant by disaster, why we need to manage disasters. So, here in this context, disaster is a cumulative impact caused by a hazard. A hazard, for example, an incident like a cyclone is an example of a hazard, or an earthquake is an example of a hazard, or a drought is an example of a hazard. So, here in this case, these hazards can be because of man-made, and these hazards can be because of natural. So, here for example, the cumulative impact here implies that, for example, if there is a cyclone, because of this cyclone, what happens is it leads to the destruction of houses, it leads to loss of life, destruction of agriculture, loss of cattle, etc., and it leads to inundation of the regions. In this process, people not only lose property and even life also. So, in this process, what happens is, the property in terms of public and private property, in terms of the transport systems, the road, railways, etc., and the power supply, etc., are lost. So, in this process, what happens is, due to, apart from these loss, the inundation may lead to spread of different kinds of diseases. So, in this process, the cumulative effect of loss of property, life, infrastructure, spreading of diseases together known as a disaster. So, this disaster management, which is being managed on the basis of Disaster Management Act 2005 in the case of India. So, why this Disaster Management Act 2005 has been made? The reason behind it is, the disaster management before 2005 and after 2005, there is a lot of difference in terms of management. The disaster management after 2005 is being described as a proactive regime. So, why this new mode of disaster management is being described as this kind of proactive regime? Because the fundamental difference here is, previously certain actions are taken only after the occurrence of the disaster. In this process, the loss of life and property is more, but when you are prepared in advance, which is considered as one of the major aspect of a proactive regime, when precautionary measures are taken, the loss of life and property can be minimized. That is one of the fundamental difference between the disaster management before 2005 and after 2005. This is being executed in terms of an institutional structure existing in our country. So, what is the institutional structure we have got in our country for the management of the disaster? What is the hierarchy existing in terms of this administration? Who are the authoritative people who are occupying these different levels of hierarchy? What is their authoritative jurisdiction? What action they can take? How they execute the policy will be part of this introduction. So, in this context, so the institutional structure and legal mechanism of disaster management, which is being based upon the Disaster Management Act 2005. So, in the case of this institutional structure of disaster management, this institutional structure is being formed on the basis of the Yokohama conference, which has happened in Japan, and the Sendai conferences later which have been happened, on the basis of which the disaster management institutional structure in our country has been established. The reason behind it is, the mode of disasters or the types of disasters, when relatively compared with the previous mode of disasters, the types of disasters have been diversified. That is the reason why previously when the disaster management portfolio is part of the agriculture department has been shifted to the portfolio of home affairs. The reason behind it is during the independence or the post-independence duration, what happens is the mode of disasters are more natural, which are more cyclonic, drought kind of aspects were related to agriculture. But with the change in time, the mode of disasters have gradually changed. That is the reason why they have shifted the portfolio of disaster management to the portfolio of home affairs. For example, if there is a terrorist attack on Taj happened a decade ago, for example. So in this context, what can the Department of Agriculture do in this case because of a man-made disaster caused by terrorism? The Department of Agriculture doesn't have any kind of authority to take any actions to control the impact of disaster. In the same case, for example, in different kinds of disasters, for example, the destruction happened because of an earthquake, or the destruction happened because of a cyclone, or for example, in the case of the corona, is a disaster where the agriculture department doesn't have much mechanism or authority to take certain steps. So the institutional structure is being framed in such a manner where at different hierarchical levels, where the authoritative positions have certain decision making powers to solve the problem. Such is the way the structure of the institution is being designed. So which is being based upon the Yokohama conference held in Japan, where our Disaster Management Act 2005 itself is being designed. So this Yokohama conference, which has held for the first time in 1994 for the management of disaster management, consequently it has led to different types of conferences which are being held, has been projected to you. Sendai conference is such one type of conference happened. So in the case of the National Disaster Management Authority is the apex institutional body which is existing in our country to make decisions on disaster management. So the Prime Minister is being made as the chairman of this NDMA. So why the Prime Minister is being made as the chairman of NDMA? The reason behind it is Prime Minister is a kind of executive authority where he can command any department possible at the central level and even at the state level. That is the reason why the structure of this institution is being made in such a manner where the highest authoritative, the real authoritative person is being placed at the apex position, is the significance of this structure. Apart from this, National Executive Committee is a body because the Prime Minister himself cannot supervise every aspect. It requires certain institutional levels at different hierarchical levels. So one such hierarchical level is National Executive Committee, which is being headed by the Union Home Secretary as the chairman and secretaries of other ministers as members. See the kind of positions this position being occupied by the personal the executive people from the Union Cabinet, who have got the authority to take decisions throughout the jurisdiction of our country's region. So this is the next level. National Executive Committee consists of all these secretaries chaired by the Union Home Secretary, so that they can command every department possible depending upon the type of disaster happens. Because if it is a disease, the medical department need to take many actions. If it is an agriculture, the agriculture department. If it is a terrorist attack, the Union Home Minister. So in this case, because of this reason, the members who are responsible to these respective portfolios in terms of secretaries are being made part of this institution at this level. Next constitutes of National Crisis Management Committee headed by Cabinet Secretary, and that is where the Cabinet Secretary's authority is so broad, where he can command many different types of departments. National Disaster Rescue Force (NDRF) who are pre-positioned. So here this National Disaster Rescue Force are recruited specially for disaster management, who have been trained to act accordingly on the basis of the type of the disaster happens. The reason behind it is, depending upon the type of disaster, the type of mitigative measures or actions need to be taken varies. For example, the actions or the mitigative measures need to be taken in the case of an earthquake or a cyclone or a pandemic like corona are not the same. So unless and until the personnel are being trained, they will not be aware of actions need to be taken to mitigate. So that is the reason why these personnel are being trained. But the problem is, the personnel essential to manage a disaster in terms of the number cannot be managed because of the financial limit we have got. That is the reason why limited people have been trained, and they have been divided into 8 battalions who have been pre-positioned at different locations of our country, so that the time consumed for these people who have been trying to travel to that location where the disaster has happened must be minimum. So these trained troops are being pre-positioned. Apart from this, because as I have already mentioned, the number of personnel who have been trained, because they might not be sufficient enough to tackle the scenario, in advance the state government personnel and the central government personnel, in terms of this kind of introduction of management, in terms of at the stage of your training in whatever department you have been selected, will be trained in terms of disaster management, so that in this process of training there is a kind of protocol to follow the authoritative levels, irrespective of the state and central government authorities, because to avoid contradictions of authority between central and state governments, there is a defined line of authority according to this act in disaster management. So to make cooperation and coordination, more coordination I can say rather than cooperation, is being acquired through this process of disaster management through this institutional structure. This is one of the main aim for structuring this institution. The next is State Disaster Management Authority, SDMA. The chairman is the state chief minister. So the state's chief minister has got the real authority to command every department possible. That is the reason why he has been made as an authoritative person as a chief in the state for disaster management. Later, the state executive committee, the chief secretary to the state heads the body. So the chief secretary is the executive or the head in terms of administration for all the personnel in the state in terms of employees. So next is District Disaster Management Authority. In this District Disaster Management Authority, the district collector is being made as the chairman, because the district collector legally has got the authority to command all the departments in the district. So see the kind of line of authority and the kind of people who have been appointed as the heads of these different hierarchical positions is in such a manner where they have got the capacity to make a command to control the situation. Next, the local authorities. In the case of the local authorities, as you know that our local authorities have been divided into tier systems, into 3 or 4 tier systems. For example, we have got the ZP chairmen or the mandal chairmen or the local panchayats. In these cases, at different levels, people have been assigned certain tasks accordingly what they have to do, so that there will be a kind of coordination for an efficient utilization of the minimum available resources to solve a problem, otherwise also known as maximization of resources, is the main aim of this institutional structure. In this case of disaster management, to understand what disaster management is, disaster management can be defined as the range of activities designed to maintain control over disaster and emergency situations and to provide a framework for helping at risk persons to avoid or recover from the impact of disasters. This is what a disaster management is. A range of activities varies from disaster to disaster, because the activities need to be done in the case of a pandemic, the activities need to be done in the case of an earthquake or a cyclone, the activities need to be done structurally in terms of construction, in terms of constructing cyclone structures is a kind of a range of activity. Formulating policies are non-structural mitigative activities. So some are structural, some are non-structural. The actions need to be taken are different, highly diversified. That is what a range of activities are designed to maintain and control over disaster and emergency situations. So because when you are prepositioning people, when the range of activities are diversified, you will be able to manage an emergency situation, piling up, procuring the essential resources varying from disaster to disaster in terms of food, medicines, infrastructure required, transportation, logistics. So in this disaster management, in this era, logistics plays a very major role here. There is a substantial difference when you relatively compare logistics and transportation here. The substantial difference here is, in the case of logistics, under any circumstances, even though the existing infrastructure or systems or the mechanisms fail to supply the essential resource to the required region, logistics search for an alternative mechanism or a route to make the services and resources are being supplied. So for example, if there is an earthquake, the transportation in terms of roadways are disrupted. So you must be able to find another mechanism of drones or helicopters, etc., to make these medicines or doctors need to be transported to the respective region. Is a logistic mechanism. So, and provides a framework for helping at risk. So whom need to be first helped? People who are vulnerable, who are at risk, need to be helped first to avoid or recover from the impact of disaster. So this is the main mode of this proactive regime of disaster management in the modern era. After understanding the institutional structure of disaster management, we shall know the objectives of disaster management. So the disaster management has got a certain objectives. What are they? To avoid human and economic loss. So loss of life is the prior aim of the disaster management. Apart from this, in terms of economic loss, varies from situation to situation. For example, if an hazard happens in a no man's land where nobody is existing there, then it doesn't lead to a disaster. Disaster happens only when there is a loss in terms of loss of human habitations or life, or loss of property or ecological damage. So here, in this condition, the economic loss can be a loss of housing, or any kind of agricultural crops or cattle, or it can be any kind of resource loss can be considered as an economic loss. So to minimize loss of life and property is one of the main objectives of disaster management. To reduce personal suffering. So here personal suffering means, for example, if in the process of disaster, for example, if the head of the family is lost, what happens is the consequential impact of the loss of the head of the family has got an impact on the rest of the family members in terms of economic activities, or in terms of different kinds of earning mechanism, etc. So in this process, we need to support these people financially and psychologically in such a manner where they are not deprived of any of these aspects in terms of security, etc. so that already they are suffering with a kind of this impact. When we support them with this kind of management, the consequential impact of disaster cannot be felt by the people. And speedy recovery. So when these kind of steps can be taken in advance, a proactive regime in expectation of a disaster, and necessary steps need to be taken, identifying the different types of disasters, identifying the probability of occurrence of a type of disaster, and zoning them geographically, so that the possibility of occurrence of a cyclone is limited to a geographical region. The possibility of occurrence of an intense earthquake is limited to a geographical region. So the necessary actions need to be taken, need to be intensified in a region where the probability of a specific disaster is more, so that the recovery can be made very speedy. Is one of the main aspects of disaster management. So the main aspects of disaster management are, for example, preparedness. You must be prepared in advance. So in this process of preparedness, there must be a procedure. The procedure need to be followed before the occurrence of a cyclone and after the occurrence of a cyclone. The procedure need to be followed after the occurrence of an earthquake or a pandemic. So stockpiling in terms of essential resource, for example, stockpiling of medicines, vaccines, food, infrastructure, transportation system, etc., fuel. These are all different aspects which you need to stockpile in advance. Awareness. People must be made aware of all these types of disasters. When do they happen? What are the precautionary measures need to be taken to avoid these kind of disasters? Increasing the knowledge about the disaster is awareness. Logistic planning, which I have discussed with you and I have given an example, and communication. So communications plays a very major role. When you have been informed in advance, the amount of time available to escape from the disaster plays a very major role in terms of loss. So the modern communication system, the satellite communication systems, plays a very major role. For example, the existing communication systems which can work only when the signal towers nearby us in the coverage area where you are, when they are being destructed, our cell phones doesn't work. So you must have an alternative mechanism of communication. For example, satellite phones work in the apps even when the telephone towers are being destructed. For example, a radio can work even without a antenna. So you need to have a certain kind of communicative systems which are helpful in speedy transmission of the information to the respective departments or to the people to escape from the disaster after being predicted. So communication plays a very major role in this context, prediction and warning. So in this disaster management, predicting the disaster with certain technologies. For example, we have developed a bio-buoyant system to predict the approach of a tsunami. Is a predict mechanism. So apart from this, for example, the prediction of a cyclone can be predicted. The prediction of the attack of a terrorist with the help of the intelligence department. So the prediction varies from scenario to scenario. For example, we are predicting the another wave of corona. We have been kept the oxygen cylinders or vaccines. We have vaccinated with the second dose and booster dose. Is a prediction and a preparedness for a kind of disaster, which is a pandemic, for example. Warning the people to have vaccines, warning the people to evacuate a place where being inundated. These are all different kinds of warning, varies from disaster to disaster. Response, reacting after the situation. So when a disaster happens, the way you need to respond to a cyclone or a pandemic or an earthquake or a terrorist attack varies. How to react and respond is being described in this disaster management. Hazard analysis means the possibility of occurrence of a hazard and how it happens, the extent being impacted, the loss of life and property, who have been affected, who are the vulnerable people, whom need to be helped. For example, hazard analysis in the case of inundation due to floods, hazard analysis in terms of an earthquake varies from hazard to hazard or disaster to disaster. So, vulnerability analysis. So, who is going to be impacted must be analyzed. For example, in the case of floods, you will be able to identify a region irrespective of the age, the geographical location is vulnerable, the low-lying region. For example, in other vulnerability analysis, for example, vulnerable people in terms of the impact of pandemic. For example, in this case, age limit is vulnerable. The older people are more vulnerable in this context. So, vulnerability varies from context to context. In the case of corona, it is age group. In the case of inundation due to floods is a low-lying region. So, you must be able to identify a region of a disaster to which people are vulnerable varies from condition to condition. The border people are being prone to more terrorist attack, low-lying region being subjected to inundation, old age people are being subjected to more diseases, pre-morbid conditions are vulnerable to certain diseases. So, vulnerability varies from condition to condition. And mitigation and prevention. In the case of mitigation and prevention, mitigation means reducing the impact of. So, the mitigative measures need to be taken to reduce the impact varies from disaster to disaster. For example, in the case of a cyclone or in the case of a pandemic, the mitigative measures is vaccination is a mitigative measure. In the case of a cyclone, making the people to evacuate from a region to escape from the disaster of a cyclone is a mitigative measure. And by evacuating the people, you can prevent the loss of life. By vaccinating, you can prevent the loss of life, providing immunity to the people. So, these are all some of the aspects of disaster to reduce the impact of disaster management. The next is major role of disaster management. So, friends, this area will be discussed in the next episode, and we shall meet in the next episode continuing the disaster management. Thank you.